In countries flirting with socialism, success is seen as a personal affront, an offense that cannot be tolerated. The rise of someone is viewed as a challenge, as if one's success were somehow a defeat for everyone else. It is no wonder that socialism finds fertile ground in this type of culture. For the average person in a healthy democracy, the success of others is proof of talent, evidence that luck smiles upon those who work hard and dedicate themselves. But for the socialist, this view is often inverted. For the frustrated, for the envious, someone's success is easier to explain as the result of a conspiracy, a cruel machination of the elites who dominate and oppress. In the socialist mentality, the capitalist is always the villain, the cold engineer of a system designed to keep the people chained. The entrepreneur is not seen as someone who has succeeded in life through merit, but rather as an architect of others' misfortune, someone who secretly plots at night with their peers, planning how to keep the masses subjugated. This mentality creates an environment where success cannot be celebrated. It must be discredited, ridiculed, fought against. The success of a businessman, of an entrepreneur, is not a source of national pride, but rather a symptom of corruption, exploitation, and injustice that cries out for revenge. And it is precisely in this poisoned ground that the socialist ideology takes root and flourishes, fueled by resentment, by the bitterness of those who prefer to believe that success can only be the result of an evil scheme. This is the genesis of a distorted worldview, where success transforms from an aspirational goal into an insult. And so the socialist sinks deeper and deeper into this perverse logic where mediocrity is exalted and success is seen as a kind of betrayal, as a breaking of the social pact of mediocrity that keeps us stagnant. It is from this foundation that the almost natural acceptance of socialism unfolds in our land, an acceptance that is intertwined with envy and frustration, and that prevents any real progress. Socialist mentality is a work of art of resentment. For the typical socialist, the world is divided between oppressors and the oppressed, and in this simplistic dichotomy, there is no room for the complexity of real life. Capitalism, in this context, is not seen as a system where free individuals exchange goods and services seeking the best for themselves and their own. It is portrayed as a machine of exclusion, a ruthless mechanism created by a Machiavellian elite to keep the people in misery and ignorance. For the socialist, the capitalist is not a businessman, not a creator of wealth, not an innovator. He is, above all, a villain, a conspirator, someone who secretly plans the ruin of others to ensure his own rise. In the socialist's mind, capitalists gather in dark rooms where, coldly, they design the most sordid plans to perpetuate social inequalities. They do not see entrepreneurship as the result of talent or effort, but rather as an inevitable consequence of a manipulated system, where only the most astute can rise in life at the expense of others' suffering. And how could it be different? The socialist mentality is rooted in distrust and denial of merit. For them, success can only be explained by external factors, by complex schemes that most people will never be able to understand or combat. Hence arises the belief that capitalism is a managed society, a system meticulously controlled by those who already hold power. This view, laden with paranoia and distrust, turns capitalism into something monstrous, an almost diabolical entity whose sole function is to perpetuate injustice. The most curious thing is that, after painting this terrifying picture, the socialist, without blinking, turns against the supposed anarchy of the market, condemning economic freedom as if it were the origin of all evils. And this is where the contradiction becomes unbearable. How can someone believe that capitalism is simultaneously a calculated machine of oppression and an uncontrolled chaos? This is the great farce of the socialist mentality, the ability to sustain two opposing ideas without realizing the incoherence. What would be a glaring contradiction for any rational mind is just another detail to be ignored by the socialist in the name of the greater struggle against the system. This state of mind, this disposition for incoherence, reveals more than a simple intellectual confusion. It shows a deep contempt for reality, a refusal to see the world as it is. And it is precisely this disposition that fuels the distorted view of capitalism, turning it into a grotesque caricature, where all the evils of the world can be explained by the ambition and selfishness of a few. For the socialist, capitalism is not just an economic system. It is the enemy, the embodiment of everything that needs to be destroyed. And this perception, however misguided it may be, is the fuel that keeps the flame of revolution alive. The socialist sees the world through a lens clouded by their own reflection. By projecting their obsessions onto capitalism, they end up drawing a grotesque caricature that has nothing to do with reality. To them, capitalism is a distorted copy of what they know all too well, the hierarchical and rigid structure of their own movement. The Socialist Party, with its inflexible order, where everything is planned and decided from the top down, serves as a model for their interpretation of the capitalist world. They mistakenly believe that companies and markets operate in the same way, as if they were controlled by a shadowy elite that dictates the rules according to their interests. This projection is the heart of the socialist contradiction. They accuse capitalism of being a prison, trap built to crush individual freedoms, but at the same time, they clamor for a system where state control is absolute, where the government decides what each person should do, think, and even desire. In the socialists' view, market freedom is a farce, an illusion created to deceive the naive, while true freedom can only be achieved through total control. It is such a glaring contradiction that can only be maintained through desperation or ideological blindness. The irony is that capitalism, this force they despise so much, is what allows the very existence of socialist parties. In a capitalist society, it is possible to organize freely, form parties, express opposing opinions, and fight for change. But in the ideal socialist regime, where everything is planned, this freedom disappears. The hierarchy they criticize in capitalism is, in fact, a pale shadow of the tyranny they themselves wish to implement. What they call equality in practice is nothing more than another form of domination, where diversity of thought and individual autonomy are sacrificed on the altar of ideological uniformity. And so, the socialist lives in a world of shadows, where personal fears and frustrations are projected as monsters that he swears to fight against. He fights against an imaginary oppression, while dreaming of establishing a real oppression, justified by the same principles that he condemns so much. He condemns capitalism for its hierarchy, while his model of society is the very definition of authoritarianism. And in this theater of contradictions, he continues his march, blindly convinced that he is fighting for freedom, when in reality he is only exchanging one chain for another, heavier and more relentless. The socialist projection is therefore a tragedy of reason, where logic is sacrificed in favor of a utopian dream that, when realized, reveals itself as a nightmare. They do not realize that the system they attack so much is the same one that allows them to exist. And in this blindness, they perpetuate an endless struggle against windmills, while the real danger is hidden within their own ranks, waiting for the time to reveal its true face. The idea of a third way is one of the most dangerous political illusions of our era. Promoted as a balanced solution, a path that avoids the supposed excesses of both capitalism and socialism, this fusion is, in reality, the embodiment of a new totalitarianism disguised as moderation. What presents itself as a harmonious synthesis between two systems is in fact a formula for the destruction of the freedoms that both, in their pure form, still preserve. The promise of the third way is seductive. It proposes that the economic dynamism of capitalism can be combined with the social justice of socialism, creating a society where everyone prospers without the conflicts and inequalities that marked the 20th century. But this vision ignores a fundamental truth. Capitalism and socialism are not only incompatible, but antagonistic in their most basic principle. Where capitalism values individual freedom and private property, socialism preaches state control and the subordination of the individual to the collective. Trying to merge them is like mixing water and oil, and the result of this attempt is always a forced compromise that brings out the worst of both worlds. The third way, in practice, has more in common with the fascist economies of the first half of the 20th century than with any democratic utopia. Just like in fascism, it preserves the appearances of a free market, but subjects it to strict state control. Private companies continue to exist, but operate under a regime of concessions and subsidies that turns them into extensions of governmental power. What was supposed to be a partnership between the public and private sectors becomes a perverse symbiosis, where the state uses corporations to implement its policies, while these, in turn, depend on the state to maintain their monopolies and privileges. The globalist propaganda promotes this fusion as if it were the pinnacle of political evolution, but what it really does is dissolve national identities, cultural traditions, and the values that sustain free societies. In the name of a supposed global justice, the third way undermines the foundations upon which any true justice can be built. Freedom, individual responsibility, and the sovereignty of nations. It imposes a cultural and economic uniformity that reduces everyone to cogs in a faceless machine, where diversity of thought and ways of life are seen as a threat to progress. This new form of fascism does not wear military uniforms, does not march through the streets with proud banners, but it is, in essence, the same old tyranny with a new mask. It uses the language of human rights, sustainability, and inclusion to hide its true objective: total control of human lives. What begins with economic regulation soon expands to the regulation of the mind, culture, and the very values that define humanity. And so, under the guise of a moderate compromise, the third way reveals itself as the only way, where all roads lead to the same destination: complete submission to state power. Fusion between capitalism and socialism does not result in a new system, but rather in the annihilation of both. Capitalism loses its creative vitality, suffocated by the shackles of state control, while socialism becomes a grotesque caricature, without the idealistic pretensions that once animated it. Product of this union is a society where freedom is a shadow, and justice a joke. The third way, instead of leading us to a fairer future, takes us back to the dark past of regimes that tolerated no dissent, and for whom power was an end in itself. And it is precisely this future that we must avoid, recognizing the fatal deception that lies behind the promise of an impossible synthesis. Modern history is not a continuous march towards progress, many believe, but an endless cycle of illusions and disillusionments. At the end of this cycle, what is seen is not the glorious rise of freedom or justice, but the silent victory of fascism. Not the caricatured fascism with its uniforms and parades, but a more subtle and insidious fascism, disguised as democracy, social justice, progress. This modern fascism does not need to impose itself by force. It is willingly accepted, even applauded, by masses who do not realize they are being led back into captivity. Fascism triumphs when freedom becomes an empty word, used to justify anything, from censorship to expropriation. It triumphs when justice is redefined to serve particular interests, when rights are turned into privileges granted by the state. And that is exactly what we are seeing in the world today. The state grows larger, extending its tentacles into every aspect of human life, in the name of noble causes such as security, equality, public health. What should be a protective barrier against tyranny becomes an instrument of oppression, and few are those who perceive the change. The triumph of fascism is also the triumph of lies. We live in an era where truth is malleable, where facts are shaped according to the needs of power. History is rewritten. Yesterday's enemies become today's heroes, and the masses, confused and disoriented, accept any narrative that is presented to them, as long as it is convenient and comfortable. This is the greatest triumph of fascism, the ability to make people accept slavery as if it were freedom, submission as if it were a choice, and what remains for those who still see reality as it is, for those who are not deceived by false promises of a utopia that never arrives. The answer is not easy, and perhaps it is bitter. Resisting modern fascism requires courage. It requires the willingness to face intellectual loneliness, social ostracism, political persecution. But it is a necessary, vital resistance if we want to preserve what is left of our humanity. The victory of fascism is not definitive, because as long as there is one free man, just one, who refuses to bow down to lies, the human spirit still lives. But this victory is undoubtedly a warning. It shows us how fragile freedom is, how easily it can be sacrificed on the altar of false security, of distorted justice. And above all, it reminds us that the fight for truth, for freedom, never ends. It is a permanent duty, a responsibility that we cannot ignore, under penalty of being, ourselves, the architects of our own slavery.